Hello beauty, in this video, I'll show you how to step by step sew a top with an asymmetric ruffle. Let's start by preparing all the top details that need to be interfaced with interfacing. Apply interfacing to the shoulder straps. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of the shoulder straps. Check in which direction the interfacing has the least stretch and cut the interfacing for the shoulder straps so that they do not stretch vertically. Fold the seam allowance by 0.5 cm on the wrong side and press. Similarly, on the other side, fold the seam allowance by 0.5 cm and press. For the back facings, I also cut out interfacing. In general, interfacing is used to prevent stretching and to add density to clothing pieces in areas such as armholes, neckline, upper edges of clothing, and other areas. I use lightweight interfacing with adhesive that adheres to the fabric using an iron. Similarly, I apply interfacing to the facings for the upper edge of the front pieces. Preparing the ruffles for the top. So we should have 2 ruffle pieces. When cutting out the pieces, pay attention to the number of pieces indicated on the pattern and to such markings as fabric fold. Cut out the required number of pieces correctly. I start with finishing the lower edge of the ruffle. To do this, on the wrong side of the ruffle, I fold the seam allowance by 0.5 cm and sew a seam 0.1 cm from the edge. Now, trim the seam allowance, leaving a 0.2 mm seam allowance. On the wrong side of the ruffle, fold the seam allowance again, but this time by 0.2 mm, then sew a seam 0.1 cm from the edge again. I process the side edges of the ruffle in the same way. First, I fold the seam allowance by 0.5 cm and sew a seam 0.1 cm from the edge. Then, I trim the seam allowance, leaving 0.2 mm. Next, I fold the seam allowance again and sew a second seam 0.1 cm from the edge. Sometimes the sewing machine can catch the fabric ends, so if you encounter this issue, you can manually sew the ends. And remember to hide the thread ends inside the seam. If your fabric has a lot of fraying at the edges, simply fold the seam allowance twice by 0.5 centimeters each and sew a seam. On the upper edge of the ruffle, you need to sew 2 rows of stitches for gathering. To do this, I set the maximum stitch width on my sewing machine, which is 4 millimeters, and I sew the first stitch 0.5 centimeters from the edge. Then, I sew the second stitch 0.2 centimeters from the first row. Before gathering the upper edge of the ruffle, it's essential to press the ruffle. This is because the seams we sewed may have slightly pulled the fabric. On the front pieces of the top, we have bust darts. First, I transfer the dart locations from the pattern to the fabric. Since the pattern includes seam allowances, transferring the dart location to both front pieces is not difficult. You just need to place the pattern on the front piece and mark the dart location. On the wrong side of the front piece, I align the dart lines and secure them with pins. For convenience, I also mark the beginning of the dart. Then, I sewed the darts. At the beginning of the darts, I avoid backstitching on the sewing machine to prevent damaging the fabric. Instead, I tie off the thread ends manually and hide them inside the darts. After sewing, I trim the excess fabric on the darts, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance, and finish the raw edges with an overlock. First, I press the dart seam. Then, I press the seam allowance upwards. I also recommend using a pressing ham to shape the dart area for a better fit around the bust. Finally, I hide the ends of the overlock threads inside the seam allowances. Before gathering the upper edge of the ruffle, you need to measure the upper edge of the front piece and the length of the shoulder strap. This will be the length for which you need to gather the upper edge of the ruffle. Also, note that from this length you've obtained, you need to subtract 2 cm because there should be 1 cm seam allowances on both sides of the shoulder strap for attaching it to the front and back pieces. Also, note that for each size of the pattern, the length for gathering will be different. Therefore, the instructions do not specify the length for gathering. You need to measure it based on your pattern size. I gathered the ruffle. Once I ensure that the gathers are sufficient, I tie off the thread ends to fix the desired length of the gather. Then, I evenly distribute the gathers. I want to mention that you can attach the ruffles to whichever front piece you prefer. I will attach the ruffles so that they are on the right side. Note that from the bottom, you need to mark 1.5 centimeters and start fixing the ruffle from this mark. Also, when reaching the top edge, mark 1 centimeter, as this is the seam allowance along the armhole line. Make sure you attach the ruffle with the right side facing up. The right side of the ruffle should be on top. For convenience, I additionally secure the ruffle with hand stitches. I attach the second ruffle. When reaching the top, I push the seam allowance along the armhole line to the side and continue connecting the two ruffles. I start stitching the ruffles from the top. And when I reach the point where the seam allowance along the armhole line is located, I stop sewing. 1 cm seam allowance along the armhole line should remain free. Then, I start attaching the ruffles to the front piece from the marked point. I take the facing for the upper edge of the front piece. I have already finished the bottom and side edges of the facing with an overlock. I place the facing with the wrong side up and the right side inside, ensuring that the right sides of the pieces are inside. When sewing the facing, pay attention to ensure that the seam allowance along the armhole line remains untouched. Now, when the facing is attached, I proceed to attach the shoulder strap to the upper part of the ruffle. Note that the seam allowance at the armhole line on the facing and front pieces has been left untouched. Thanks to the preparation of the shoulder strap at the very beginning, where we pressed the seam allowances, it will be convenient and easy to sew it to the ruffles now. I push the seam allowances along the armhole line on the front piece and the facing to the side and pin them to keep them out of the way when attaching the shoulder strap to the ruffle. I place the shoulder strap with the wrong side up. I start pinning the strap, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance at the beginning of the strap, which will be tucked inside the armhole in the next steps. Similarly, on the side where the strap will be sewn to the back piece, I also leave a 1 cm seam allowance. If it turns out during the process that the length of the ruffle is longer than the length of the strap, it's not a problem. You can manually gather the ruffle at this point. In my case, this happened, so I manually gathered the ruffle additionally. Then, I sew the strap to the ruffle that I sew the seam along the line that I prepared at the beginning of preparing the strap with the iron, which means a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Now, when the seam is sewn, you can see that the 1 cm seam allowance on the strap is still free. I turn the front piece to the wrong side. I also turn the facing to the wrong side of the front piece. I turn the seam allowance along the armhole line on the facing to the side. And I direct the seam allowance at the end of the strap inside the wrong side of the front piece. Then, I fold the strap in half and pin it. Next, I need to sew along the edge of the strap. Before doing this, make sure that the seam allowances on the armhole seams from the front piece and the facing are pushed to the side and do not interfere with the seam. We only need to sew along the strap. Now that the seam on the strap is sewn, I direct the seam allowance along the armhole line on the front piece inside and pin it. I direct the strap downwards. I also direct the seam allowance along the armhole line on the facing inside and pin it. Then, I join the armhole lines of the facing in the front piece. Note that you need to direct the strap downwards so that when you turn the top to the right side, the straps should not be visible. Only the ruffle along the shoulder line should be visible. The strap is directed downwards and hidden under the ruffle and the wrong side of the top. After turning the front piece to the right side, I additionally sew hand stitches to join the armhole lines of the front piece and the facing. I sew a seam 0.1 cm from the edge. Sewing the second piece of the front. To do this, I prepare the shoulder strap. I fold it in half with the wrong side inside and sew a seam 0.1 or 0.2 centimeters from the edge. Then, I attach the strap to the upper point of the front piece. For convenience and confidence, I secure the strap with hand stitches. You can also secure it on the sewing machine. Next, I take the facing and place it along the upper edge of the front piece, right side down, wrong side up. I secure the facing to the front piece with pins. Sew. Once the seam is sewn, I trim the seam allowance on the strap to avoid unnecessary bulkiness in that area. Then, I sew hand stitches along the upper edge from the wrong side. Hand basting stitches provide neatness and accuracy to the clothing lines before the ironing process. After turning the piece to the right side, I trim the excess seam allowance of the facing along the bottom edge. Similarly, on the other front piece, I trim the excess seam allowance of the facing along the bottom edge. I then join the front pieces together along the bottom edge. Note that when joining the pieces together, on the side of the front piece without the ruffle, you need to leave a 1 cm seam allowance. I am additionally secure with hand stitches. Next, I need to sew the front pieces together along the bottom edge with a temporary seam, 0.5 cm from the edge. I join the back pieces along the relief lines. Fold the back pieces together with their right sides together. And to stitch. A tack must be placed at the beginning and end of the seam. First, I press the seam itself. Then, I press the seam allowance towards the center of the back piece. I have already finished the raw edges of the seam allowances with an overlock. Also, the central edges of the back pieces are overlocked. Before attaching the back pieces to the front, I need to sew the straps to the back piece. I lay out the pieces to make it convenient to sew the straps to the back piece and ensure they are attached correctly. I pin the strap to the back piece and take the facing for the upper edge of the back piece, placing it right side in, wrong side up. I pin the facing in place. Note that the bottom edge and side edges of the facing are overlocked. I fix the second strap to the second back piece. I turn the ruffles to the side and pin them to keep them out of the seam. For convenience, I additionally secure the straps with hand stitches to ensure they don't twist during the process of attaching the facing to the back piece. To stitch. So, on the wrong side of the back piece, I bashed the upper edges with hand stitches. At this stage, the bottom edge of the back piece and the front piece should be finished with an overlock. To join the back pieces to the front along the side edges, I turn the facings upwards and open the seam allowances to avoid bulkiness in these areas. I pin together the side edge of the back piece and the side edge of the front piece. After turning the top to the right side, I move the ruffle to the side at the bottom and pin it to avoid it getting caught in the side seam. Then, I sew along the side edges. I open the seam allowances along the side seams. From the wrong side of the top, I bash the upper edges with hand stitches. I open the seam allowances on the side seam, guide the facings down, fold them over on the wrong side, and fasten with hand stitches on the wrong side. I will be using an invisible zipper for this tutorial. I will sew the zipper so that it opens from bottom to top. At the bottom, I leave a 1 cm seam allowance for finishing the lower edge of the asymmetric top. You can choose any type of zipper based on your design preferences. At the top, I direct the facing upwards and sew the zipper up to the fold line of the back piece and facing. I additionally secure the zipper with temporary hand stitches. On the second back piece, I also direct the facing upwards and open the seam allowances before sewing the zipper. Before sewing the zipper on the sewing machine, I close the zipper to check if it's attached correctly so that the bottom and top lines of the top match. To hide the upper ends of the zipper, I first trim the top ends of the zipper, leaving a 1.5 cm seam allowance. To conceal the top ends of the zipper, the seam allowances on the facing need to be folded inward, and then the facings should be directed to the wrong side of the top. You can secure the facings with hand stitches. Additionally, you can stitch the facing allowance along with the center back seam allowance on a sewing machine. To do this, fold the facing seam allowance with its right side to the seam allowance along the center back seam. At the bottom, I fold the seam allowance 1 cm towards the wrong side and secure it with hand stitches. Now, the seam along the bottom edge needs to be sewn 0.5 cm from the edge on the right side of the top. When I reach the beginning of the ruffle, I finish the seam. Then, I turn over the ruffle and start the finishing stitch along the bottom line from where the ruffles are attached. To secure the facings, I pin the facing at the armhole and sew a seam in the side seam from the right side of the top. All that's left is to join the front pieces. To do this, I align the front pieces and first sew them with hand stitches. Before sewing the seam on the sewing machine, I recommend basting with hand stitches and trying it on to ensure the front pieces are properly aligned. Then, I need to sew the seam below the line where the ruffles are attached. For this top, I use taffeta fabric, and with that, the process of sewing the top is complete. See you in the next lesson. Bye.